The early hours of March 18, 1943, unfolded like any customary training period at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley observed his cadre of dive bomber trainees as they ascended into the cockpits of their SBD Dauntless aircraft, the very same formidable machines that had decisively altered the trajectory of the Battle of Midway merely 9 months prior. However, a disquieting anomaly marred the statistical data. Over the preceding 6 weeks, Flatley had tragically witnessed the loss of more aviators to mishaps during training exercises than he had in actual combat operations throughout the entirety of the Guadalcanal campaign. The emerging pattern was both unmistakable and profoundly alarming. These incidents were not attributable to the inexperience of novices or to mechanical malfunctions. Rather, seasoned pilots, individuals who had already endured and survived hazardous combat missions, were executing textbook-perfect dive-bombing maneuvers directly into the unforgiving expanse of the ocean. Reports emanating from other training installations across the nation corroborated this unsettling narrative. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, at Naval Air Station Pensacola, and at various airfields nationwide, dive bomber pilots were perishing under circumstances that defied any rational tactical explanation. They would meticulously roll inverted, initiate their descent into the dive, maintain the precise 70-degree angle mandated by operational doctrine, track their intended targets with flawless precision through their bomb sights, and then, inexplicably, fail to execute the recovery maneuver. There were no distress calls transmitted via radio, no erratic flight patterns indicative of control issues. The aircraft would steadfastly maintain its steep dive trajectory beyond the designated bomb release point, past the safe altitude for pullout, until the immutable laws of physics rendered any recovery an impossibility. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask US to stay with US and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Investigations conducted at crash sites consistently revealed intact control surfaces, engines operating without fault, and airframes devoid of damage save for the catastrophic impact. It was as if the pilots had succumbed to sleep at the most critical juncture. Yet, they had not merely fallen asleep. The phenomena unfolding within those cockpits were far more insidious than simple fatigue. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been receiving perturbing field dispatches since late 1942, but the sheer magnitude of the predicament only became undeniably evident when squadron after squadron began to lose pilots to what official records euphemistically termed failure to recover from dive. This phrase thinly veiled a harsher reality that no one was eager to confront. The very dive bombing methodology that had secured victory at the Battle of Midway was now claiming the lives of the skilled individuals who had mastered it. The meticulous precision and rigorous discipline that rendered dive bombing so devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft carriers had inadvertently created a physiological predicament that human biology was ill-equipped to endure. Commander Flatley initiated a comparative analysis of observations with his counterparts in other training departments, and a disturbing consensus quickly materialized. The pilots who were tragically succumbing were not the careless individuals who took shortcuts or the reckless ones who pushed beyond their operational limits. On the contrary, they were the scrupulously precise, by-the-book aviators who adhered to doctrine with unwavering exactitude. These were the individuals who held their dives until the absolute final second to guarantee maximum accuracy. They were the ones who had internalized the brutal mathematical realities of dive bombing. Every additional 100 feet of altitude at the point of bomb release translated into dozens of feet of potential deviation from the target. Against a rapidly maneuvering warship, Such a missed distance could signify the crucial difference between a successful hit and a wasted ordnance. Consequently, these pilots had assiduously trained themselves to wait, to sustain that screaming descent, to maintain the target precisely centered in their sights until the very last possible moment before initiating pullout. And this unwavering discipline, this profound commitment to accuracy, was tragically claiming their lives in numbers that seriously jeopardized the operational viability of the entire dive bomber force. What had not been adequately accounted for was the profound impact on the human body when a formidable 2-ton aircraft transitioned from a 70-degree dive at a speed of 300 miles per hour into a recovery arc. The mathematical calculations were straightforward. The physiological responses were anything but. When a pilot exerted force on the control stick to commence the pullout, he was not merely altering the aircraft's trajectory. He was subjecting his entire circulatory system to forces it had never evolved to withstand. At the nadir of a typical dive bombing pullout, pilots experience between 5 and 7 Gs, meaning their blood instantaneously weighed 5 to 7 times its normal mass. This blood, obedient to the unyielding principles of physics, was mercilessly drained away from the brain and accumulated in the lower extremities and legs. The sequence of events unfolded with a rapidity that surpassed conscious thought. Initially, there was a loss of peripheral vision, a phenomenon pilots referred to as grayout. The outer edges of the visual field would gradually dim into a colorless haze as the retinas, deprived of oxygen-rich blood, began to cease functioning from the periphery inward. This typically occurred at approximately 4 Gs and afforded the pilot a mere 2 seconds of warning. This was swiftly followed by tunnel vision, where only the central portion of the visual field remained operational, constricting into a narrow circle that rendered instrument readings nearly impossible. At 5.5 Gs, the majority of pilots would experience complete blackout, a total cessation of vision while technically remaining conscious. At 6 Gs and above, consciousness itself would begin to wane. The brain, receiving perhaps only 30% of its normal blood supply, would simply shut down as a self-protective mechanism. This is precisely what rendered dive bombing so exceptionally perilous. The entire pull-out maneuver, from its initiation to achieving wings-level flight, typically spanned between 4 and 6 seconds. However, G-induced blackout could commence in less than 2 seconds, with complete unconsciousness potentially following within 4. The temporal alignment was catastrophic. A pilot would initiate his pullout, perceive the escalating G-forces, sense his vision beginning to constrict, and then his conscious awareness would abruptly vanish precisely at the moment of greatest need. The control stick would slacken, the pullout would cease midway through its arc, and the aircraft would continue its plunge into the water with an unconscious pilot at the controls. Even more tragically, when the G-forces finally abated, either because the aircraft entered a terminal spiral or simply because it impacted the water, consciousness would sometimes momentarily return in that final terrifying second, granting the pilot just enough awareness to comprehend his imminent demise. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine conducted rigorous tests at the centrifuge facility in Pensacola, subjecting volunteer pilots to the exact G-force profiles recorded during dive bombing pullouts. The findings were profoundly sobering. When pilots were forewarned of impending high G-forces and instructed to tense their leg and abdominal muscles, a technique known to delay blackout by a crucial second or two, they were able to maintain consciousness through pullouts that would otherwise render them unconscious. However, in the exigencies of actual flight, during the final critical seconds of a dive, with the target rapidly approaching, and their attention entirely engrossed in maintaining the bombsight's pipper-centered, pilots invariably neglected to perform the anti-G straining maneuvers. Their conscious minds were too overwhelmed and task-saturated. By the time they initiated the pullout, it was already too late to adequately prepare their bodies for the immense forces about to be unleashed. The German Luftwaffe had encountered this identical problem 4 years earlier, and their resolution was as brutal as it was remarkably effective. In 1939, during the combat trials of the Ju-87 Stuka over Poland, the Luftwaffe tragically lost 7 aircraft in a single week due to inexplicable dive accidents. Pilots, who had performed flawlessly in training, were inexplicably plunging straight into Polish farmland, with their bombs still affixed. The subsequent investigation revealed that experienced pilots were blacking out during pullouts at rates that rendered the Stuka operationally unsustainable. However, unlike the Americans who would confront this crisis years later, the Germans had the distinct advantage of an engineer named Hans Ulrich Rudd working directly alongside the design teams at Junkers. And Rudd vehemently advocated for a solution that completely eliminated the human element. By early 1940, every Stuka rolling off the production line was equipped with an automatic pull-out system. The mechanism was ingeniously simple in its design. The pilot would preset a recovery altitude on a barometric switch before commencing his dive. And when the aircraft reached that predetermined altitude, pneumatic actuators would automatically retract the control column, irrespective of the pilot's actions. Even if the pilot was completely unconscious, even if he had entirely released his grip on the stick, the aircraft would autonomously recover from the dive. The system incorporated a mechanical override, a prominent red handle that the pilot could pull to regain manual control. However, that override necessitated a conscious decision. If the pilot had blacked out, the automated system would infallibly save his life without any input from him whatsoever. The results were immediate and dramatic. Stuka loss rates attributable to dive accidents plummeted by over 80% within 3 months of the system's widespread deployment. Pilots recounted experiencing the control stick wrenching itself backward during pullouts they barely remembered initiating. Some described regaining consciousness in level flight with no recollection of the preceding 5 seconds. The automatic system yielded a secondary, unforeseen benefit. It enabled pilots to sustain their dives for longer durations. The knowledge that the aircraft would automatically recover itself at a preset altitude meant pilots could keep their bomb sights on target through the final, crucial seconds without the added burden of worrying about initiating the pullout themselves. They could focus entirely on achieving maximum accuracy and implicitly trust the mechanism to shield them from the physiological consequences. Yet, when American intelligence officers meticulously examined captured Stukas in North Africa during 1941 and 1942, they regrettably dismissed the automatic pull-out system as typical German over-engineering. The American aviation community harbored a deep-seated cultural skepticism toward automation. Pilots were inherently expected to fly their aircraft, not to permit machines to perform that essential function for them. The prevailing sentiment was that properly trained aviators should not require mechanical assistance to prevent blacking out. They should simply strive to be superior pilots. It was widely believed that aviators simply needed to enhance their piloting capabilities. This perspective, however, stubbornly persisted despite the mounting evidence from numerous accident reports. For instance, when skilled Navy test pilots meticulously evaluated a captured German Ju-87 dive bomber at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, their comprehensive assessment acknowledged the presence of an automatic pull-out system. Yet, they dismissed it as a mere compensatory mechanism for pilots lacking sufficient expertise, rather than recognizing it as a pragmatic solution to an underlying physiological challenge inherent in the demanding maneuver. This deeply ingrained misjudgment would tragically continue to claim American lives for another arduous 8 months before the harsh realities of combat unequivocally compelled a significant shift in established doctrine. The USS Yorktown's Air Group 3 had cultivated an impressive reputation for its exceptional precision and unwavering operational effectiveness. The pilots comprising this distinguished unit were far from inexperienced recruits fresh from rudimentary flight school. Rather, they were seasoned combat veterans who had honed their formidable skills and earned their stripes during the brutal Solomons campaign. These were individuals capable of delivering a colossal 1,000-pound bomb with pinpoint accuracy onto a destroyer's deck from an astonishing altitude of 10,000 feet. Nevertheless, on the somber date of March 22, 1943, during what was anticipated to be a routine training exercise conducted off the sun-drenched Florida coast, Lieutenant Robert Chin tragically failed to execute his critical pullout from a dive. His vigilant wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, bore witness to the harrowing spectacle as Chin's dauntless aircraft steadfastly maintained its perilous dive angle well past the designated bomb release point, and even beyond the crucial altitude where the pullout maneuver should have commenced. The aircraft continued its terrifying descent until it catastrophically impacted the water in a near-vertical plunge, leaving behind almost no recoverable wreckage. Lieutenant Chin's untimely demise marked the squadron's third fatality within a mere 2 weeks, and regrettably, he was not destined to be the last to perish in such circumstances. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Just 5 days later, during the very same training exercise, Lieutenant William Stamper initiated his dive with routine precision. However, his radio communication remained eerily silent, and his aircraft maintained its unyielding trajectory. Observers positioned on the deck of the Yorktown watched through powerful binoculars as Stamper's SPD Dauntless held its dive through every critical altitude marker, agonizingly awaiting the pullout that never materialized. The subsequent impact generated a towering plume of white water that was distinctly visible for miles across the ocean. Tragically, Stamper had been Lieutenant Chin's flight instructor, a testament to his extensive experience. He had bravely endured and survived the brutal carrier battles at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, and had logged an impressive record of over 300 carrier landings. Yet, he met his end while performing a training exercise that he could have, under normal circumstances, executed effortlessly in his sleep. When the squadron's aircraft finally returned to the Yorktown that afternoon, the commanding officer, acutely aware of the escalating tragedy, immediately grounded the entire dive bomber element, pending a thorough and urgent investigation. Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded the crucial Fast Carrier Task Force operations, had witnessed more than enough of these devastating incidents. He promptly issued a decisive order to the Bureau of Aeronautics, demanding that they cease treating these recurring accidents as isolated misfortunes and, instead, begin to address them as an urgent, systemic crisis requiring immediate and comprehensive attention. The subsequent investigation meticulously compiled data from every single Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron operating across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters of war. The statistics that emerged were utterly staggering and deeply concerning. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the Navy had tragically lost an alarming total of 47 dive bomber pilots due to critical pull-out failures during training operations alone. This figure was, remarkably, greater than the number of pilots lost to direct enemy action during the identical period. Furthermore, combat squadrons were reporting that a significant 15 to 20% of their pilots experienced at least a partial blackout during operational dives, and several vital combat missions had been severely compromised when section leaders lost consciousness during critical attacks, necessitating their wingmen to break formation and escort them safely back to base. In response to this escalating crisis, the Bureau of Aeronautics swiftly convened an emergency panel at Anacostia Naval Air Station. This crucial gathering brought together a diverse and expert group, including highly specialized flight surgeons, innovative aircraft designers, seasoned combat squadron leaders, and courageous pilots who had personally survived blackout incidents. For 3 intensive days in early April, this distinguished panel meticulously dissected and rigorously reevaluated everything they thought they understood about effective dive bombing technique. During this period, intrepid test pilots undertook instrumented dives, meticulously equipped with advanced medical monitoring apparatus strapped to their chests. This sophisticated equipment precisely recorded vital physiological data such as heart rate, blood pressure, and critical blood oxygen levels during each distinct phase of the dive and subsequent pull-out maneuver. Concurrently, high-speed cameras, strategically mounted in accompanying chase aircraft, captured the exact moments when pilots' heads would involuntarily slump forward or their hands would release the control stick, providing indisputable visual evidence. The accumulated evidence was absolutely irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile, as it was then rigorously taught in every Navy flight school, was fundamentally physiologically unsustainable. Pilots were being trained to execute an intricate maneuver that human biology simply could not reliably endure. The prevailing doctrine unequivocally had to change, yet, perplexingly, no one on that expert panel could reach a consensus on how to modify it without inadvertently sacrificing the critical accuracy that made dive bombing such an indispensable and effective combat tactic in the first place. The pivotal breakthrough, surprisingly, originated from an entirely unexpected source, not from the ranks of esteemed admirals or highly specialized flight surgeons, but from a relatively junior officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Riley, who had been courageously flying combat missions off the venerable aircraft carrier Enterprise since the decisive Battle of Midway. Riley had quietly begun to implement a technique that flagrantly violated every established principle of conventional dive bombing doctrine, and he had deliberately kept it confidential, fearing severe reprimand for his unconventional approach. Instead of initiating his crucial pullout at the conventionally prescribed altitude of 2,500 feet and releasing his bomb during the initial phase of the recovery arc, Riley had been daringly holding his dives until a much lower altitude of 2,000 feet, and sometimes even as low as 1,800 feet. Crucially, he released the bomb at this significantly reduced altitude, where his aircraft was still oriented in a nearly vertical attitude. Subsequently, he would execute a more gradual and controlled pull-out maneuver, which effectively distributed the intense G-forces over an extended period. This innovative technique was, according to the official manual, entirely backwards. The established protocol dictated that one should release the bomb early in the pullout to afford maximum recovery time. However, Riley's bombing scores were inexplicably superior to those of anyone else in his squadron, and remarkably, he had never experienced even a momentary grayout. When Lieutenant Riley finally elucidated his groundbreaking technique during the pivotal Anacostia Conference, the initial reaction was one of profound skepticism, bordering on outright hostility. A high-ranking commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics bluntly informed him that he was undoubtedly fabricating his reported release altitudes, asserting that no pilot could possibly achieve consistent accuracy from below 2,000 feet. Furthermore, the existing bomb sight calculations did not even account for bomb releases at such extremely low altitudes. However, Riley possessed irrefutable evidence in the form of gun camera footage. When the panel meticulously reviewed this compelling footage, they observed something that directly contradicted every prevailing belief they held regarding bombing accuracy. Riley's bombs were consistently impacting within a circular error probable (CP) of merely 35 feet, a performance substantially superior to the 65-foot CP that was universally considered excellent for dive bombing operations. The underlying reason for this remarkable accuracy became unequivocally clear once aerodynamicists meticulously ran the numbers. The standard technique involved releasing the bomb early in the pull-out arc, when the aircraft was transitioning through an approximate 60-degree dive angle. At such an angle, the bomb possessed significant horizontal velocity, which necessitated intricate calculations and corrections. Wind effects were substantial, and the bomb's trajectory described a complex parabolic curve, requiring the pilot to lead the target and meticulously account for multiple variables. Conversely, Riley's ultra-low releases occurred when the aircraft was still nearly vertical, typically between 75 and 85 degrees nose down. At this extreme angle, the bomb essentially dropped almost straight down with a minimal horizontal component. Wind effects became negligible, and the trajectory was, in essence, a straight line from the point of release to the point of impact. This ballistic simplicity directly translated into enhanced accuracy. The bombsight mathematics that had seemed erroneous for low releases were, in fact, perfectly accurate. They simply had never been properly tested because established doctrine dictated that a pilot would be incapacitated or killed before reaching such perilous altitudes. The G-force advantage offered by Riley's method was equally significant. By bravely holding the dive for a longer duration and then executing a more gradual pullout, Riley was effectively distributing the same total G-load over a period of 7 or 8 seconds, rather than compressing it into a mere 4 seconds. Consequently, the peak G-forces experienced were considerably lower, hovering around 4.5 gs instead of the more severe 6 or 7 gs, which safely kept him below the critical blackout threshold. More importantly, the gradual onset of the G-forces afforded his cardiovascular system ample time to compensate. His blood pressure could adjust progressively, and he could effectively maintain his anti-G straining maneuvers throughout the entire sequence, preventing his physiological defenses from being overwhelmed by a sudden, intense spike in G-load. While this technique undeniably demanded immense nerve, pushing the aircraft deeper into the danger zone before initiating recovery, the underlying physics were irrefutable. Lower, more gradual pullouts were demonstrably both safer and significantly more accurate than the prevailing doctrine that was tragically claiming pilots' lives on a weekly basis. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, had been diligently conducting wind tunnel research on bomb trajectories since as early as 1941, but astonishingly, no one had considered applying their invaluable data to ultra-low altitude releases until Riley's unconventional technique compelled a comprehensive review. When NACA engineers at the renowned Langley Research Center finally ran the full aerodynamic models, they uncovered something that, in retrospect, should have been glaringly obvious but had been obscured by decades of deeply entrenched doctrinal assumptions. The standard 2,500-foot release point had, in fact, never been chosen primarily for its accuracy. Instead, its selection was driven solely by safety considerations. It was intended to provide pilots with the maximum possible time to recover if any unforeseen complication arose. However, this safety margin had been calculated under the flawed assumption that pilots would remain fully conscious and entirely capable throughout the entire pull-out maneuver, an assumption that was now demonstrably false. The wind tunnel data unequivocally revealed why lower releases consistently produce tighter impact patterns. A bomb released at 2,500 feet during a pullout would travel approximately 180 feet of horizontal displacement before impacting the target. During this extended flight time, it was susceptible to wind drift, subtle air density variations, and complex aerodynamic interactions between the bomb's stabilizing fins and the turbulent air trailing behind the diving aircraft. Even minute variations in release timing, differences of just a tenth of a second, could translate to a significant 15 or 20 feet of missed distance on the target. In stark contrast, a bomb released at 1,800 feet in a nearly vertical attitude would travel perhaps only 40 feet horizontally before impact. The flight time was dramatically shorter, the trajectory inherently simpler, and the margin for error consequently reduced to an astonishing degree. Release timing variations that would cause substantial misses at higher altitudes produced negligible deviation at these much lower, near vertical release altitudes. The crucial empirical confirmation arrived through a meticulous analysis of combat footage. The United States Navy had, since the pivotal Battle of Midway, diligently accumulated gun camera film from every single combat mission. This vast archive contained frame-by-frame documentation of countless bomb releases, each accompanied by discernible impact points. When seasoned analysts meticulously sifted through this extensive film library, specifically scrutinizing the correlation between release altitudes and subsequent accuracy, the findings proved irrefutable. Pilots executing bomb releases from below 2,000 feet, whether through deliberate intent, much like the case of Riley, or inadvertently by extending their dives beyond the conventional recovery point, consistently achieved impact patterns that were a remarkable 40% tighter than those observed from pilots adhering to the established doctrinal release altitude of 2,500 feet. Furthermore, the very lowest releases, those performed within the narrow band of 1,600 to 900 feet, yielded a level of precision that approached, and in some instances matched, the accuracy previously attainable only through slower, glide bombing attacks conducted at significantly lower speeds. The underlying mechanics of G-force distribution unveiled the remaining pieces of this complex puzzle. Utilizing highly sensitive accelerometers strategically installed within specialized test aircraft, engineering teams painstakingly charted the precise G-loading profiles generated during pullouts initiated at various altitudes. A recovery maneuver commenced at the doctrinal 2,500 feet necessitated the immediate and maximum application of back pressure on the control stick. At this elevation, the pilot was already rapidly depleting their available altitude, compelling an abrupt and forceful arrest of the dive. This aggressively executed recovery, unfortunately, produced the characteristic 6 to 7 G spike, a physiological stressor frequently responsible for inducing blackouts among pilots. In stark contrast, a pullout initiated at a lower altitude of 1,800 feet afforded the luxury of a more gradual recovery. While the pilot was indeed closer to the water surface, their more vertical attitude at that point facilitated a longer, more forgiving recovery arc. This revised approach meant that instead of abruptly yanking the control stick rearward, a pilot could apply a steady, progressive back pressure, allowing the aircraft to smoothly roll out of its dive over an extended duration. Consequently, the identical change in altitude was accomplished through the application of demonstrably gentler forces. The peak G-load consistently remained below 5 gs, a threshold well within the physiological limits where pilots could sustain full consciousness and maintain their operational effectiveness without impairment. While conceptualizing a shift in operational doctrine was one facet of the challenge, the monumental task of retraining an entire combat aviation force to execute maneuvers diametrically opposed to their deeply ingrained muscle memory presented an entirely different, and far more formidable, obstacle. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. In June of 1943, the Navy took decisive action, establishing an experimental dive bombing school at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, operating under the direct and meticulous supervision of Commander Fladley. The entire curriculum underwent a radical overhaul, meticulously reconstructed from its foundational elements to embrace what was officially termed the delayed pull-out technique. However, within the squadrons, pilots swiftly adopted more colloquial expressions, referring to it as riding the edge, or more simply, the late pull. The initial and arguably most profound hurdle proved to be psychological, the formidable challenge of persuading seasoned, combat-hardened pilots that intentionally flying closer to the water before initiating recovery was not, in fact, an act of suicidal recklessness, but rather a fundamentally safer and more efficacious methodology. The comprehensive training regimen commenced with intensive classroom sessions, which, by their very nature, bore a closer resemblance to rigorous physics lectures than to conventional flight briefings. Pilots were immersed in detailed presentations concerning G-induced loss of consciousness, complete with intricate charts illustrating complex blood flow patterns during high G maneuvers and sophisticated graphs correlating G onset rates with the precise probability of experiencing a blackout. Expert flight surgeons provided thorough explanations of the exact physiological cascade that occurred within the human visual system when the delicate retinal tissues were deprived of essential oxygen. The instructors meticulously ensured that every single pilot grasped the fundamental truth. This innovative approach transcended mere courage or inherent skill. It was, at its core, a matter of fundamental human biology. The most valorous, most exceptionally skilled pilot in the world would inevitably succumb to a blackout at 6 Gs if the pull was executed with excessive force and insufficient duration. The overarching objective was not to futilely combat the relentless G-forces, but rather to master their management, to meticulously distribute their impact over an extended time frame, thereby allowing the human body to adapt progressively instead of abruptly shutting down. Following the theoretical groundwork, the curriculum transitioned to intensive instrument work. This novel technique demanded an absolute and unwavering trust in altimeters, even in high-stress scenarios where every primal instinct screamed for an immediate and precipitous pullout. Instructors guided pilots through exhaustive practice sessions within link trainers, which, despite their rudimentary nature as early flight simulators, proved invaluable. Here, pilots repeatedly executed dive profiles, continuously vocalizing their altitudes. Passing 3,000, holding angle, passing 2,500, holding angle, passing 2,000, sight picture, steady, 1,800, initiating pullout. This continuous stream of verbal callouts served to keep their conscious minds actively engaged, effectively counteracting the debilitating tunnel vision that frequently led to a critical loss of altitude awareness. Pilots meticulously practiced these sequences until the callouts became an automatic, ingrained verbal rhythm, a deeply embedded response that would persist even under the most acute combat stress. The practical flight training meticulously introduced the new technique through a series of carefully graduated steps. Initial flights involved practice dives conducted without any bomb load, with pullouts commencing at 2,200 feet, a mere 300 feet lower than the previously established doctrine. Instructors flew alongside in chase aircraft, providing continuous, real-time altitude updates via radio. Pilots diligently learned to discern and recognize the subtle visual cues that precisely corresponded to 1,800 feet, the specific apparent size of the target, the unique geometry of the horizon, and the precise sight picture that unequivocally signaled, "Now!" They honed their proficiency in the gradual pull-out, mastering the art of applying steady, controlled back pressure instead of instinctively yanking the stick. Furthermore, they rigorously practiced anti-G straining maneuvers, initiating them proactively before the pull-out and maintaining them throughout the entire recovery sequence. They were taught to forcefully grunt with each breath, simultaneously tensing their leg and abdominal muscles in a coordinated effort to effectively trap and retain blood in the upper body, thereby mitigating G-induced physiological effects. By August of 1943, the Naval Air Station Jacksonville was consistently graduating pilots who demonstrated an exceptional capability to release their ordnance from altitudes ranging between 1,700 and 900 feet, achieving circular error probables consistently under 40 feet, and, critically, experiencing zero G-induced incidents. While this enhanced training regimen necessitated an additional 3 weeks compared to the former curriculum, the resultant improvements were utterly irrefutable. Squadrons that subsequently received these newly trained pilots reported staggering accuracy improvements, ranging between 35 and 50%, when compared to squadrons still operating under traditional techniques. Even more significantly, the training accident rate plummeted to virtually zero. While pilots undoubtedly still experience apprehension, diving to 1,800 feet before initiating a pull-out demanded every ounce of their discipline, they were no longer succumbing to fatal accidents. The efficacy of the technique was unequivocally proven, and the Navy was now faced with the imperative task of deploying it across every carrier air group stationed in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a critical undertaking before the commencement of the next major offensive operation. The delayed pull-out technique received its inaugural large-scale combat test during Operation Forager, the pivotal invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. Task Force 58, comprising an impressive complement of 15 fleet carriers, converged upon the Philippine Sea, and every single dive bomber squadron within this formidable force had undergone retraining in the new doctrine over the preceding 8 months. On June 19th, amidst the intense aerial engagements that would later be immortalized as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers confronted their ultimate and decisive validation. Japanese carriers unleashed a torrent of massive aerial strikes, overwhelming American combat air patrol controllers and necessitating an urgent strategic pivot. The call reverberated across the airwaves for dive bombers to reallocate their mission from attacking enemy ships to intercepting the incoming Japanese strike packages before they could reach the American fleet. What ensued was an unprecedented and rigorous test of accuracy under the harshest of combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage, leading Bombing Squadron 10, VB-10, from the legendary aircraft carrier Enterprise, spearheaded an attack against a formidable formation of Japanese carrier bombers positioned at 12,000 feet, an altitude where dive bombing had previously been deemed marginal at best. Employing the newly mastered delayed pull-out technique, his pilots initiated their dives from this high altitude, maintained their steep descent directly through the heart of the Japanese formation, and released their ordnance at altitudes below 2,000 feet, all while maintaining blistering speeds exceeding 280 knots. The resulting bombing accuracy was nothing short of devastating. Subsequent post-action analysis unequivocally credited VB-10 with the destruction or significant damaging of 23 Japanese aircraft in a single, decisive pass, an extraordinary rate of accuracy that would have been utterly unattainable with the antiquated high-release technique. Ramage's own bomb struck a Japanese K-torpedo bomber with such surgical precision that the ensuing explosion scattered wreckage across an astonishing quarter-mile radius. Crucially, not a single pilot within his squadron reported even a partial blackout during their recovery maneuvers, underscoring the physiological benefits of the new method. The comprehensive statistics emanating from the Marianas operation painted a complete and compelling picture of success. Dive bomber squadrons, now proficient in the delayed pull-out technique, achieved an impressive hit rate of 32% against rapidly maneuvering warships, a dramatic improvement when juxtaposed with the historical averages of 18 to 22% observed in earlier battles. During the concentrated strikes against Japanese carriers on June 20th, bombs released from below 2,000 feet accounted for an overwhelming 14 of the 18 direct hits, meticulously recorded by American dive bombers. The Japanese carrier Hyo, for instance, sustained 3 direct bomb hits in rapid succession from VB-2 pilots, all of whom released their ordnance between 1,500 and 1,850 feet. The precision was so remarkable that 2 of these bombs penetrated the very same elevator shaft, punching through the flight deck with incredible accuracy. The carrier succumbed to its damage and sank within hours, and subsequent post-war analysis of the wreckage revealed impact patterns clustered within an astonishing 50-foot circle, a level of accuracy that, just 18 months prior, would have been considered utterly impossible. Pilot survival statistics exhibited an equally dramatic and encouraging improvement during the 6-month period immediately following the widespread implementation of delayed pull-out training. Incidents of G-induced loss of consciousness plummeted by an astounding 91% across all carrier air groups. Furthermore, combat loss rates directly attributable to dive accidents receded to statistically insignificant levels, fewer than 1 pilot per 1,000 sorties, a stark contrast to the alarming rate of 15 per 1,000 recorded during the perilous days of early 1943. The innovative technique had unequivocally resolved the critical blackout crisis. However, its impact extended far beyond mere survival. It had achieved something even more profound. It had fundamentally redefined the very capabilities and potential accomplishments of dive bombing as a tactical weapon. The newfound ability to execute accurate ordnance releases from ultra-low altitudes fundamentally transformed the operational landscape. It meant that dive bombers could now effectively engage targets that had previously necessitated the deployment of multiple squadrons. A single aircraft could achieve mission kills on destroyers, while 2 plane sections possessed the capability to effectively disable cruisers. By the time the Okinawa campaign commenced in April 1945, the delayed pull-out technique had become so thoroughly ingrained and seamlessly integrated into established dive bomber doctrine that young pilots arriving directly from training command were entirely unaware that any alternative technique had ever existed. They had been rigorously trained to ride their dives down to 1,800 feet from their very first training hop, and, by comparison, the old high-altitude releases now appeared recklessly inaccurate and inefficient in their eyes. The conclusive statistical analysis emerging from the extensive naval engagements of the Pacific War vividly illustrated a profound shift in aerial combat tactics. It unequivocally demonstrated that dive bomber units, rigorously trained in the innovative delayed pull-out technique, achieved remarkably superior operational effectiveness. These specialized squadrons inflicted damage upon or successfully sank an astounding 47% more enemy vessels per mission compared to their counterparts, who adhered to the bombing methodologies prevalent before 1943. This enhanced destructive capability was not merely a matter of increased accuracy. It was accompanied by a significant reduction in aircraft attrition rates, ensuring greater pilot survival and fundamentally redefining the role of the dive bomber. What was once considered an imprecise area weapon, capable only of broad, less targeted attacks, was meticulously transformed into an instrument of exceptional precision, capable of striking specific targets with unprecedented accuracy. This groundbreaking methodology, which in its nascent stages during 1943 had been widely perceived as extraordinarily perilous, even suicidally dangerous, eventually ascended to become the universally accepted benchmark against which all subsequent bombing techniques were rigorously evaluated. The pilots who mastered this demanding approach were individuals who had painstakingly learned to prioritize the immutable laws of physics over their innate human instincts for self-preservation. They had undergone intensive training, compelling themselves to prolong those terrifying, screaming descents for crucial seconds beyond what every natural reflex and every nerve ending in their bodies vehemently urged them to do. This profound mental and physical discipline fundamentally rewrote the established doctrines of naval aviation. We encourage you to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please feel free to leave a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Ultimately, their unwavering commitment to refining this audacious strategy by consistently executing the delayed pullout not only yielded superior battlefield results, but also permanently altered the trajectory of aerial warfare. These courageous aviators, through their innovative application of physics-based flight dynamics and their sheer mental fortitude, effectively demonstrated that pushing beyond conventional limits could lead to unparalleled operational success and usher in a new era of precision in maritime combat, fundamentally achieved by mastering the art of the late pullout.